It was with a search on the internet.
So I apologize, Senator. I apologize.
In your letter to the governor, here's what you say. As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. So if you believe that about our prisons, how are you going to ever sentence somebody to prison?
So, Senator, I will need to take a look at that letter, and I apologize that that's not something I found to hand to this committee.
You're not denying you said that.
Wow. Okay. Did you just see that? I have watched a lot of Senate confirmation hearings, and I cannot remember the last time I saw someone get caught out that cleanly, that fast, and that publicly. Senator John Kennedy just walked into that hearing room with a letter that the nominee, Professor Fonzone, was supposed to hand over to the committee himself and didn't. And Kennedy pulled it up from a Google search. He literally told Fonzone, "Put your name into Google. You'll find it in about 3 nanoseconds." Now, before we get into the full breakdown, I want to be fair to Fonzone. Confirmation hearings are high pressure and people forget things. I get that. But there is a difference between forgetting a small detail and failing to disclose a letter where you called on a sitting governor to stop arresting people, release prisoners en masse, and shut down transfers to ICE. That is not a minor detail. That is a worldview. And that worldview has serious implications for the kind of Judge Fonzone would be on the federal bench. So stay with me. Once we watch the full video, I am going to break down every exchange and tell you exactly why I think Kennedy was not just doing politics here. Kennedy was doing his job. If you care about accountability and who gets to sit on the federal bench and make decisions that affect your life, hit subscribe right now. Let's watch.
Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just feel like I need to ask this question. Mr. Fonzone, when you advised the companies referenced, Huawei and others, you were at Sidley?
Yes, that's right, sir.
And when a client comes to Sidley, you have to fill out a form that says, here's my client name, here's my mailing address for business purposes, and here are my political beliefs. Is that the way it works?
There's definitely a client intake process. I don't remember all the particulars of it.
I mean, big law it's kind of like who can pay the freight, right?
That's an aspect of the intake process, I'm sure.
I understand. Professor, I'm looking at a letter dated March 16, 2020. It's a letter to Governor Lamont in Connecticut. The title of it is Urgent Action Needed to Protect Individuals in Connecticut's Prisons and Jails from Coronavirus 19 Pandemic. Did you sign that letter?
So I don't recall sitting here today, Senator.
Here's your signature. Here it is back here. Why didn't you turn this over to us when you were asked to submit documents?
So, Senator, I made every effort to search for everything that I had ever signed. That's not a letter I remember, but I will certainly take a look at that. And
we found it was with a search on the internet.
So I apologize, Senator. I apologize.
In your letter to the governor, here's what you say. As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. So if you believe that about our prisons, how are you going to ever sentence somebody to prison?
So, Senator, I will need to take a look at that letter, and I apologize that that's not something I found to hand to this committee.
You're not denying you said that.
I do need to see the letter to see the context, because again, it's not something I remember adding my name to. I can assure you, Senator.
And you also say, first, you call on Governor Lamont to release everybody in jail. Is that right? Because of the coronavirus?
So again, Senator, I would need to see that letter in front of me. It certainly was not.
You can find it just put your name into Google. You'll find it in about 3 nanoseconds.
I will, Senator. I can assure you that
You said in your letter, Professor, we call on Governor Lamont, state of Connecticut, and all Connecticut jurisdictions to immediate release to the maximum extent possible people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction. And then you go on to say, talking once again about our jails, the global COVID-19 pandemic is throwing into sharp relief the untenable state of our penal system and the need for sustained action to shrink its scale, shrink its size, and shrink its scope. You sound here like the district attorney in San Francisco. If you believe that, how are you going to ever sentence anybody to jail, Professor?
I can assure you, Senator, that I understand the role of the judge, and that I can assure you prison time is an appropriate sentence in many cases.
That's not what you say here to the governor. You wrote the governor. This isn't some DoorDash delivery guy. You wrote the governor of your state 3 years ago.
So again, Senator,
you were in law school.
So again, Senator, I would need to look at the letter. It sounds like it was written at the height of the pandemic, where governors were looking for.
You also wrote the governor, you said, people over the age of 55 are at the greatest risk for COVID-19, but also pose the least public safety risk to our communities. People in this age group can and should be released immediately to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. You think the governor just, if you're over the age of 55, he should let everybody go?
No, Senator, that's not a position.
That's what you said.
Okay.
Here it is, biggest Dallas.
Again, Senator, I will look at that letter. I can assure you that.
Find it on Google, Professor. You also say Governor Lamont should issue an executive order to direct the state's attorney offices and law enforcement entities, including the town and city police departments, and any federal law enforcement entity operating within the state, to immediately cease adding to the incarcerated prison population given the high risk of infection posed by the population increase. You asked the governors to tell every law enforcement official in the state to stop arresting people and putting them in jail, didn't you?
So again, Senator, I have to look at that letter. I do think there were modifications that the governors were making around the country to respond to the pandemic.
You also had an opinion in your letter about, can I have another 30 seconds, Mr. You had an opinion in your letter about immigration. You said immigration detention poses the same health risks to jails and prisons, and Connecticut law enforcement must stop feeding people into the unsafe and inhumane immigration detention system. Then you say Governor Lamont should release all individuals currently in state custody who are awaiting transfer to ICE custody, and the governor should declare a moratorium on all such future transfers. How, if somebody is in our country illegally and commits a crime, are you going to put them in jail if you believe this about immigration?
Senator, I can assure you, were I so fortunate to be confirmed, I would treat crimes seriously.
That's not what this letter says, Professor, and it was 3 years ago. It wasn't when you were in law school, and you didn't turn it over to us. We had to find it on our own.
Senator, the chair has been generous in time. I think you've had.
All right, we are back. Now that you have seen the whole thing, let's talk about what just happened. Start with the letter. Fonzone signed it in March 2020 during the early chaos of COVID, addressed to Governor Lamont of Connecticut. You might say, it was a pandemic, everyone was panicking, it was a different time. And I would say, fair point. Context matters. But read what is actually in that letter. Fonzone did not just say maybe we should reduce prison crowding during a health crisis. Fonzone called prisons and jails detrimental to public health and human rights. Not overcrowded prisons are dangerous during a pandemic, but the entire institution of incarceration framed as a human rights violation. Fonzone called for releasing people convicted of crimes, not just pretrial detainees, and argued that anyone over 55 should be freed because they pose the least public safety risk. Fonzone asked the governor to tell every law enforcement agency in the state, including federal agencies, to stop putting people in jail altogether. And then Fonzone called for ending transfers to ICE and placing a moratorium on future transfers. Meaning if someone is in the country illegally and commits a crime, Fonzone's position was, do not hand them over to immigration enforcement. Kennedy asked Fonzone a simple, direct question. If you believe this, how are you going to send anybody to prison? Fonzone's answer? I can assure you I understand the role of a judge. That is not an answer. That is a deflection. Kennedy was not asking Fonzone to recite the judicial oath. Kennedy was asking Fonzone to reconcile a signed public document with the responsibilities of a federal judge. And Fonzone could not do it. What struck me most was how methodical Kennedy was. Kennedy went line by line through that letter and gave Fonzone every opportunity to explain. Every single time Fonzone fell back on, I would need to see the letter, even while Kennedy was reading it out loud right in front of him. At some point, I don't remember, stops being a credible answer and starts being a strategy. Here is the broader point I want you to take away. Federal judges serve for life. They do not run for re-election. Once Fonzone is confirmed, the voters have no recourse. The only real accountability happens in that hearing room with senators asking exactly the questions Kennedy was asking. So when people criticize Kennedy for being aggressive or for bringing up a 3-year-old letter, I would ask, when exactly should this conversation happen? After confirmation? After Fonzone has a lifetime appointment and is issuing rulings from the bench? The whole point of a confirmation hearing is to surface exactly this kind of information. And the fact that Fonzone did not voluntarily disclose a letter that Kennedy found in seconds on Google tells you something. Either Fonzone forgot it existed, which raises questions about thoroughness, or Fonzone remembered it and chose not to include it, which raises far more serious questions. Kennedy read the documents, asked the hard questions, and did not let vague reassurances substitute for real answers. Regardless of your politics, that is what serious oversight looks like. That is my take. Drop yours in the comments. Did Fonzone deserve a harder time, or did Kennedy go too far? Let's talk about it. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.